Ja, good afternoon, my relatives. It's just afternoon here in Washington, D.C., and I'm sitting down with my second cup of coffee. And I want to talk about the dysfunction and the hypocrisy of white America's attitudes towards immigration and refugees. But before I begin, I want to do as I always do by acknowledging I'm speaking to you from, it's now called Washington, D.C., but these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor the Piscataway as the hosts of the land where I'm living. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And again, I just want to state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. If you noticed, I'm wearing my shirt again that says "Not Today, Colonizer." I bought this shirt when I was back in on the Navajo Nation. I was actually in the flea market in Gallup, and I was walking through, and there was a lot of vendors selling shirts and other things, and I was able to pick up a few. But I really like this shirt. I found this shirt sitting in the rack of one of the vendors, and I got to talk to the woman who was selling it, and the shirt is a little too raw to just wear publicly, right? It's a little kind of in your face. But I bought it because I knew there were going to be days when I would be sitting here having my second cup of coffee or talking about something where I just had to, more than just verbally, stand up and say, "Not today, colonizer," right? Not, just stop. Not today, colonizer. Because there's times when the antics of our nation and the absurdity of the dialogue that is going on around us, it gets reaches such a level that at some point you just have to sit both sides down and say, "Who the hell do you think you are?" Right? Who do you think you are? And today is one of those days. I've been watching this story. It's been playing out for several months now. Obviously, Republicans are very upset that they're not able to, their wall is no longer being built. And they're actually trying to find other ways to build it both at a state level, and they're doing a lot of other things. I actually spent some time down in El Paso talking with people about what's going on at the border and looking at some of the actions that are being taken. But one of the most dehumanizing antics that are being taken is happening in Arizona, uh, Texas, and Florida, where the governors of those three states are literally shipping migrants like cargo off to sanctuary cities and democratic-led states, and just basically dumping these migrants and these refugees into the streets in these cities. So before we start screaming, because I know, as I said in the thing here, there's nothing that triggers the trauma of white America more than a discussion about immigrants and refugees. So before white people on either side of the aisle just begin screaming at each other, let's talk rationally about this, okay? So at one level, right, the Republicans aren't wrong. The states on the border, for many reasons, carry a bulk of the burden, or a lot of the burden, of what do we do with undocumented and even documented immigrants and refugees who come into our country. Um, and we can't deny, right? There is probably an unequal share of the burden that these states are carrying. And so for these states, especially at a time when they are not in agreement with the direction the nation is going, it is appropriate for these states to request help and say, "Hey, we would like some help dealing with the challenges that is being created and that exists in our country, and so we would like some help with that." And so on one hand, it's not, again, removing the politics and the childish antics that all three governors are using in this, to say, "Hey, we would like to help ask some of these other burdens, especially states and cities that agree with the policies that are being enacted, to help us share some of the burden of a lot of undocumented people now being um, released or put into the streets of our cities and of our state. So that's not entirely unreasonable. However, the way they're doing it, which is radically, majorly dehumanizing, right? All they're doing is, this is a political stunt meant to energize their base. They're putting these men, women, and children onto buses, and they're shipping them to different states, and they're dumping them out, sometimes literally in the streets, and just saying, we're not going to deal with you. You go find friends in your democratic cities, is what they're saying. And this reached kind of a frenzied peak this week when two plane loads of migrants to were sent to Martha's Vineyard, and then two more, or another couple buses, were sent to Vice President Kamala Harris's house here in DC. And I'm going to put these stories in here just so you can read them, because this is literally what they're doing. And again, this is absolutely dehumanizing. It's using people as props in a reality game show that the Democrats and Republicans are playing with each other. And it's dehumanizing them, and it's creating more chaos and more confusion in an already chaotic and confusing situation. And it is not respecting the dignity and the humanity of the people who are seeking refuge here in our country. And so it was when I heard the stories of, literally yesterday, two busloads of migrants were literally dropped off in the streets in front of Vice President Harris's home, and just dumped there. They were brought. They've been coming into our district for a long time, but they've been coming mostly to Union Station, where there have been teams of people to meet them and to kind of process them and to get them to resources or some places where they can at least get some shelter. But this busload was literally just dropped off on the street as an antic, as a political ploy, as a very childish behavior. And yesterday, Greg Abbott, the governor from Texas, tweeted that, and I'm going to share his tweet. He took credit for it. And in his official governor account, he took credit for this behavior. And he said, this morning, two Texas buses of migrants arrived at the Naval Observatory in D.C. VP Harris claims our border is secure and denies the crisis. We're sending migrants to our backyard to call on the Biden administration to do its job and secure the border. So this is what they did. Let me give you it didn't accept the whole tweet, so let me put the rest of this in there. Make sure you get the whole tweet. So anyway, that was the tweet that was sent out yesterday. Now, of course, the left is responding and Christians are responding. And so if you go back and look at this, and I'm going to share this with you on the screen. So here's the tweet by Greg Abbott. And if you, hold on just a second, got to get something straight here. Okay, here we go. So here's the tweet by Governor Abbott. And then, of course, it was responded to. And I want to read the reply. Where did it go? Sorry. Oh, well, sorry. Let me share. There's another tweet I want to share with you. Let me bring this up here. I'm going to put this into the comment section. And the reason I'm going to put this there is there was a tweet here. Sorry, I didn't have this quite as organized as I wanted to. So there was a reply to this tweet. It was by someone whose name is Fafa Girl 102. And she said, I thought the Bible told you to welcome the foreigner and not mistreat them. I've actually read it. You might want to try it since you claim to be a Christian. And so this is now where things start getting a little bit crazy, because now we start talking about, especially Christian activists on the left, saying we need to do this because this is what the Bible says and this is the way we need to handle this. And if you follow down the thread of this tweet, you now see Christians from both the left and the right screaming at each other. Here, Raymond H. says Romans 13, 1-7 makes abundantly clear that God expects us to obey the laws of the government. The only exception is when the law of the government forces us to disobey a command of God. Illegal immigration is breaking of a government's law. So again, therefore, and again, this is now where, and I'm going to just be blunt about it, Christian nationalists from both the left and the right begin screaming at each other and hitting themselves over the head with different verses. And I'm going to say Christian nationalists from both the left and the right, because again, what is the left arguing? Based on what the Bible says, this is what we're supposed to do as a government, right? They're making a Christian nationalist argument that our government should be following the guidelines and the exhortations of the Bible. This is their argument. In fact, there's a lot of verses that they put out there. I'm going to just share a few of them with you here, right? So one of the verses that people like to throw around comes from Leviticus 19, 33 through 34. It says, do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land. Treat them like native-born Israelites and love them as you love yourself. Remember that you were once foreigners living in the land of Egypt. They also like to throw out Exodus chapter 23, which says, you must not oppress the foreigner. You know what it's like to be a foreigner, for you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. Now, the interesting thing is that both of these verses tell Israel to treat migrants and refugees well, because they must remember that they once were migrants and immigrants themselves, but now they're in their promised land. And now they have the resources and the capacity to care for migrants and refugees well. And so he's saying, remember, you were migrants and refugees. Now you're not. Now you're in your promised land. And so therefore, you need to take care of migrants and refugees. And it gets most explicit in this other passage that people like to quote. It's from Jeremiah 7. They usually use verses 5, 6, and 7. And so verse 5 and 6 say, if you really change your ways and your actions and you deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you don't follow other gods to your own harm, right? So these are not bad exhortations. It's taking care of the oppressed, taking care of the widow, the foreigner, the refugee, so on and so forth. But the motivation for that verse comes in verse 7 that says, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever. And this is where we have to point out the left, whenever they use these verses, are absolutely making a white Christian nationalist argument. They're saying our government, which governs a pluralism of people, right? A pluralistic society with people from every faith traditions, our government, they are arguing, needs to obey the law of the Christian, even the Jewish Old Testament Bible. And again, why? Because, to spell it out, our nation likes to call itself a nation of immigrants. And they also like to claim that this is Europeans' promised land. And so their argument, when you boil it down, is we all immigrated here, and now we're in our promised land, and therefore we need to care for the foreigner, the refugee, and the oppressed. That's their argument when you boil it down. This isn't the argument the right is making. This is the argument the left is making. We immigrated here, our families, our relatives, our neighbors, our families immigrated here. This is our promised land. And God, one of the requirements for us to keep our promised land is to treat refugees and immigrants well. That's their argument. Again, not from the right, from the left. Again, as I've said in other speeches and other places, white Christian nationalism is a bipartisan value. And if you don't believe that, you need to wake up and turn off CNN. Just turn off MSNBC. Right? They're never going to tell you these things. But this is what the left argues. Now, when I was living on the Navajo Nation, and when I was living in the Hogan, where we lived for 3 years, we lived on the reservation for 11 years, but we lived in a very remote section in this remote area of the reservation. We were 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road. We were living in one-room Hogan, had no running water, no electricity. We had an outhouse 50 yards away outside of our home. Our whole community was, it was a community. The sheep camp we lived on, there was no running water at all in that whole area of town, or electricity out there, not town, of that community. And so we lived literally off the grid. And on the sheep camp where we lived, they had sheep, and there were some shepherds on there, and I would occasionally go out and herd sheep with some of the shepherds. And there was one of the shepherds there who had lived much of his life on the reservation. He was a boarding school survivor. He spoke better Navajo than English. And I was out herding sheep with him one day, and this is the early 2000s, right? George Bush was in office, and we were beginning to talk about immigration reform, and it was becoming kind of a buzz around the country. And as we were walking through the fields, I said to my friend, the whole country is talking about immigration reform. I'm curious, what are your thoughts as a Navajo man who's lived on the reservation much of your life? What are your thoughts? And he said, well, there's already so many of them here. Maybe we shouldn't worry about borders anymore. I stopped and looked at him, and the profoundness of his words kind of blew my mind, right? Because if we were anywhere else in the country, you would assume he was talking about the 14 million undocumented immigrants who had come over our southern border in the most recent years. But because we were both Navajo, because we were on the reservation, because he was a boarding school survivor, you had to at least pause and ask, is he talking about the 14 million or the 300 million? Is he talking about those who recently jumped a fence to cross the border? Or is he talking about the wave after wave after wave of white Europeans who have come here since the founding of this country? And I love the ambiguity of it so much, I didn't even ask him to clarify it. I left that statement there. And I began telling people that if you want to comprehensively and justly reform our nation's immigration law, you have to bring Native peoples to the table. Without Native people at the table, our country is incapable of comprehensively and justly reforming immigration law. Why? Because all you have is one generation of undocumented immigrants trying to figure out what to do with another generation of undocumented immigrants, and there's no integrity in the dialogue. The entire thing is hypocrisy. It doesn't matter if you're saying build a fence wall and keep them out, or tear the wall down and let them in. If you are undocumented, you actually don't have a right to say either. And this is where it falls apart, because again, this points out the white Christian nationalism of the left. because they truly believe that they used to be immigrants. Yes, their families immigrated here, but this is their promised land, which God has given to them. Now they're established here, so now they're required by that God to care for immigrants and refugees. That's one of the conditions to keep their promised land. The left is just as white Christian nationalism as the right. They just argue it differently. Right? And this is true, because what else? If you're a white American, tell me what document you have. What document does your church have? Does your city have? Does your state have? Does your government have that gives you the right to live where you live? It's not a treaty. Yeah, there were treaties, but they've all been broken, which means not only does that diminish the rights and the lands of Native peoples, but it means white people, the United States, no longer has jurisdiction to the lands that were included in that treaty. The only document you're going to find that gives you the right to be here is the doctrine of discovery, which argues that natives aren't human, don't have the capacity to be sovereign over land, therefore they're merely occupants. And so because white Americans landed here and discovered these lands, they're the true title holders. That's the only documentation you're going to have. There's no treaty. They've all been broken. This is why immigration is such a trigger for white Americans. If you want to get white Americans screaming at each other, bring up immigration reform. You will get the left and the right screaming at each other. And they're both arguing Christian nationalism in one way, shape, or form of another. And so when Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis and whatever the governor's name of Arizona is start shipping off migrants and refugees to other states, dehumanizing them and using them as pawns in their energizing their base. Yeah, what they're doing is not just wrong, it's evil. It's dehumanizing and it's evil. And then when the left says, we used to be immigrants, now this is our home, this is our promised land, and one of the requirements of our promised land is to care for these refugees and migrants. They're arguing Native people have no say in this because they're not fully human. They're perpetuating the dehumanizing narrative of the doctrine of discovery. This is why this nation keeps screaming about this thing, because the solution is bring natives to the table. Well, we can't do that. They might tell us all to leave. Well, who knows? They might. It's absolutely their right. I don't know if they will, but yeah, I admit that's scary. Right? This is why back when I was first teaching about this stuff, this is in the early 2000s, a bit before 2010, a bit after 2010. I was giving a lot of platform. Sojourners, CCDA, the Christian Reformed Church, all these organizations love to hear me come in and talk about a Native perspective on immigration reform and how without Natives at the table, we can't really justly and comprehensively reform immigration law. They love to bring that into me until April of 2013. Do you know what happened in April of 2013? On April, let me give you the date. I'll share this story with you. On April 18 of 2013, the Gang of Eight, I'm going to put this into the chat session. The Gang of Eight, 8 Democrats and 8 Republican senators proposed a bill to reform immigration law. The second that bill was on the table, not only did my speaking invitations to talk about a Native perspective on immigration reform dry up, but literally, most of the organizations that I partnered with threatened to either mute my voice or rethink their partnership with me if I continued to press a Native perspective on immigration reform. Because now that there was a political bill on the table, they had to fight to get that bill passed. So we could no longer talk about the root of the injustice. Now we just had to pass this bill. And this is where they begin throwing around verses like Jeremiah 7, verses 5, 6, and 7. Yeah, I kid you not, the moment, the day that immigration reform bill was put forward by the Gang of Eight, my invitations dried up and my relationship with most of these organizations became endangered, right? I was now a threat to their political agenda. And they couldn't allow me to speak on their stages anymore, at least not saying the things I was saying. So this dysfunction goes back decades and long before that. This is just since I've entered the conversation. And so when I see things happening like what Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott are doing, I'm absolutely beside myself. What they're doing is evil. But when I see the argument that the left, and especially the Christian left, is making to counter what they're doing, it's no better because it's just as dehumanizing to Native peoples. So let me repeat my statement. President Biden, Greg Abbott, Ron DeSantis, all of you white landowning men who are screaming at each other over immigration reform. Say this very clearly one more time. Without Native peoples at the table, the United States of America is incapable of comprehensively and justly reforming immigration law. Without natives at the table, all we have is one generation of undocumented immigrants trying to figure out what to do with another generation of undocumented immigrants, and there is no integrity in the dialogue. And you know what, Donald Trump? Because you piss me off too. Your generation and the generations of white people ahead of you were so much worse than what these latest waves of migrants and refugees were doing. Your ancestors actively committed genocide against Native peoples. They actively enslaved people. So I need you to shut the hell up. If you ask me, white landowning men have very little, if any, voice in immigration reform bills. No integrity, either side. Bow out of the conversation. Christians, and I'm not just talking the MAGA white evangelicals, progressive, left-leaning Christians, please stop using your Bible and your notion of promised lands to justify what you want your nation to do. You are not God's chosen people, and Turtle Island is not your promised land. You do not have a covenant with the God of Abraham. You do not have a land covenant with the God of Abraham. Please end your white Christian nationalist arguments now. Immigration, migration, refugees are an absolute mess. An absolute mess on both sides of the aisle. And until we begin to wrestle with who we are as a nation and what we've been doing for 250 years, we are not going to fix the problem. We're not. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Those are my thoughts. Not today, colonizer. We need to completely reframe this dialogue and hold it in a way that acknowledges the humanity of everybody. And guess what? It's going to make it more complex. It's going to make it harder. The left isn't going to get their bill passed tomorrow the way they want to. But if you want to fix the problem, you got to do the work. You got to do the work. So anyway, you can tell this dialogue infuriates me. I've watched it from the vantage point of the reservation. I've listened to these stories of people from the margins. I've been to the border. I've sat on our reservation. I've looked at the history. And this is the conversation that brings out, that triggers white America more than as quickly as it triggers white America very, very, very quickly. And it demonstrates not only their own dysfunction, but their incredible hypocrisy as they both argue and fight for their own version of white Christian nationalism. So we have a lot of work to do, my relatives. We have a lot of work to do. For the moment, we have to reframe the conversation. We have to reframe the dialogue. We have to stop allowing white landowning men from either side of the aisle pretend they know anything about what they're talking about. We have to point out their hypocrisy, their insane arguments, their dehumanizing understandings of their own scriptures and their own foundations. And we have to have a conversation that acknowledges the humanity of everybody. It's going to make the conversation longer. It's going to make the solution more complex. But it's going to allow us to finally address the root of the issue. I hope this is helpful, my relatives. I have a meeting I have to jump off to. I'm actually filming a podcast this afternoon. And so I need to work on that. But yeah, I hope you have a great day, my relatives. I will continue to address this as it comes up. We'll continue to talk more about it. But walk in beauty, my relatives, and maybe learn how to walk in beauty together. Achahat and Hakonet.